spent a year traveling in Peru, and then wrote a book called The Conquest of the Incas about Pizarro's conquest of Peru. But then I thought I'd do the same for the other side of the continent, for the Brazilian side, and write the conquest from the Atlantic coast of Brazil. But that turned it was intended to be one book. It turned into 3 books because, of course, Brazil is half the continent, but also the conquest, for want of a better word, of its indigenous people is still going on. There are still a few isolated, uncontacted peoples.
Welcome to Mongabay Sessions. I'm your host, Mongabay founder Rhett Butler. In this series, we'll be interviewing some of the world's leading conservation thinkers and doers about their experiences and what can be done to make the world a better place. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy.
So thanks for joining us, John. I'd love to hear what prompted your interest in the Amazon.
Well, I spent, after Oxford and a couple of years of working, I spent a year in Peru and saw a bit of the Amazon there. And then my great friend from Oxford, Richard Mason, had the idea of a river called the Iriri in central Brazil was possibly the largest unexplored river in the world. So we decided to try and be the first to descend it and map it. And the idea was well accepted in Brazil by their mapping agency, the IBGE, and also by the Brazilian Air Force, because they said that part of Brazil, this is long ago, in 1961, long before GPS or satellites. And so the government mapping agency sent 3 of their surveyors with us. And then we hired 5 expert woodsmen, Brazilian woodsmen, and then there were 3 British. And that's when I first met Orlando Villas-Boas in 1961, who gave us very good advice, because we could sort him out as already Brazil's most famous explorer and its biggest expert on indigenous people. So we asked Orlando whether we would be in any danger from indigenous people called Indios in those days in that part of Brazil. And he said, as far as he knew, that in those forests there was no tribe that would be a threat to us there. And he also gave us some very good advice about starting at a little airstrip that the Villas-Boas had created for the Brazilian government in a sort of bald patch of forest. We're talking miles and miles and miles, tens of thousands of miles of unexplored forest. So we started out from this air base, little airstrip called Cachimbo, and we cut for about 3 or 4 months, cut trails, and finally found what we reckoned was the headwater of the Iriri. And then we had our 5 woodsmen cut down 2 trees and turn them into dugout canoes. And then we, meanwhile, carried up all our supplies from the little airstrip. And we're just about ready to descend the river when one day on our main path, very near the camp was just a circle of hammocks and a campfire in the middle. There was Richard Mason had been killed. He's, I think, the last, he may even be the first Englishman ever to be killed by a completely unknown tribe. An unknown indigenous people had laid an ambush on our trail, and he was the first of the 11 of us who walked into that ambush. He was just walking along the trail carrying a load up. but his body was surrounded by arrows and clubs, and so we got it out. But that was my first experience of the Amazon and of cutting trails. And then in Peru, I'd spent a year traveling in Peru, and then wrote a book called The Conquest of the Incas, about Pizarro's conquest of Peru. But then I thought I'd do the same for the other side of the continent, for the Brazilian side, and write the conquest from the Atlantic coast of Brazil. But that turned, it was intended to be one book. It turned into 3 books, because Brazil is half the continent, but also the conquest, for want of a better word, of its indigenous people is still going on. There are still a few isolated, uncontacted peoples. So what was intended to be 1 volume turned into 3 volumes, Red Gold, Amazon Frontier, and Die If You Must, which cover the 400 years from the first arrival of Europeans up until the 20th century. So that and the meeting with Orlando Villas-Boas and my friend being killed by indigenous people, all these things came together to make me really very interested in Brazil's indigenous peoples. And the Brazilians gave me permission to visit any tribe, as they were then called, in the country. So I spent 2 years in the early 70s traveling, visiting about 45 different indigenous groups all over Brazil. And 4 of them were the Brazilian Indian Service, called FUNAI, it's from Fundação Nacional do Índio, was their highest grade was the sertanistas, who were the people who is skilled enough and empowered to try to make first contacts. And so I had the privilege of seeing four indigenous peoples at the time of their first contact: the Suruí, the Maracanã, Assurini, and the Galera group of Nambiquara. So that all these things heightened my great interest in those marvelous people. And I've been to Brazil frequently since then. Society in London for 21 years, which was a great experience, because it was 2 decades when the whole world was becoming really excited and interested in the environment. And so I was able to modernize and improve that great society in many ways. But one of the things in that 21 years, one of the things I'm proudest of is that we launched 11 big multidisciplinary research projects, always invited by the host country. The days of just putting a pin in the map and saying, "Oh, let's go and explore there." That's it, ceased now. But we were all invited. And one of the invitations was from the Brazilian Environmental Agency, in those days called SEMA. It's the precursor of IBAMA, their current environment agency, inviting us to give them a survey and do research on a newly created reserve area called island called Maracá in the extreme north of Brazil. It's a huge riverine island, about 60 kilometers long by 25 wide, in the Urariquera, which is a headwater of the Rio Branco. So I decided to lead that one myself. And while I was still director of the society, I said to my wife, you're not going to see me for any holiday for the next 3 years. And that project, the Maracá Rainforest project, it was done in partnership with 2 Brazilian agencies, with INPA, their great Amazon Research Institute in Manaus, and SEMA, the precursor of IBAMA, of their environment agency. And it grew and grew to be the largest rainforest research project ever in the Amazon, ever created by a European. In the end, I had about 150 doctoral level scientists over a 2-year period, and a further 50 odd technicals, which are rainforest experts in Brazil. We didn't have fancy degrees, but knew a hell of a lot about the forest. So that was a marvelous project, and we had 5 main research programs in it. One on rainforest regeneration. We had control plots, 5 different types of forests, and observed over a 20-year period the regeneration under different conditions. Then another program was on the hydrological cycle, the water cycle. In a forest, you have the nutrient cycle of all the falling vegetation and dead monkeys or whatever, which is all reabsorbed by the growing biomass. Then we had a program on insect disease vectors, and then another human geography program on settlement on that savanna forest frontier. But the biggest program was in answer to the request from SEMA, was to give them a sort of inventory of all the flora and fauna of this beautiful uncontacted forest. But it had no indigenous people living in it anymore. They had moved away when it was on the edge of Yanomami territory. Anyway, that was a great project, and I got to know just about everybody in this was in the late 1980s, 1987, 88. The Brazilians gave me the Order of the Southern Cross for that. So all these things add together to a great love of Brazil and a huge interest in its indigenous people.
I just wanted to follow up on one point you made early on, which is cutting trails. And I just don't think most people today understand what's involved with that kind of work and just how hard it is in a place like a remote area in the Amazon rainforest. So would you be able to recount what it's like to do that physically and mentally for?
Yes. Well, can we come back to the Villas Boas themselves? Could I tell you a bit about them?
I'm going to come back to them, but I just want to follow up on that.
Because one of their great achievements was cutting some spectacular trails. Well, cutting a trail, it's first of all, it's typical. You can only do it with a machete. A chainsaw is useless, and it's one of these relatively few things in life that hasn't advanced at all. Cutting a trail is exactly the same now as it was 100 years ago, and you hack away. You have to sharpen your machete quite often. Otherwise, in the early morning, you can clear a creeper or something quite quickly. But by the end of the day, you're getting quite tired. You have to have a team of at least 5 people because you've got to be carrying up food. And the way we did it, we would have one of us we would try to keep our trail on a very straight line. It's part of our exploring. So we would see a tree or something a few meters ahead, throw our compass away because it would be throw it to one side because the machete would, or certainly throw the machete to one side when you took the compass bearing, and then push your way through, and then a couple of men with us would clear the little trail behind you. And in a day, different types of forests. Some tall forests were really quite open at ground level. Other times it was very closed vegetation, and you're almost hacking a tunnel through it. You could do 3 or 4 kilometers a day. And then we'd move our camp, the circle of hammocks, up every week or so. Always when you found a stream. We wouldn't carry water when you're cutting, because it was too heavy. But you hoped you'd run into a stream. And some days you didn't, and you were very, very thirsty by the end of the day when you went back to the camp. But it's quite satisfying, because it's just you against the forest, and you see your steady advance. Can I then talk about the Villas-Boas brothers, who they were 3 São Paulo middle class of good family young men in their 20s. Just after the war in 1946, President Getúlio Vargas of Brazil had this idea of cutting into their massive tropical rainforests, as opposed to exploring them by river, which is what had been done the previous 4 centuries. And I don't know quite why, but the Villas-Boas were the only educated young men who got very interested and tried to join up, and did join up, and very soon found themselves running it. The first stage was to cut from the Araguaia at Rio das Mortes diagonally across to the upper Xingu. That phase took about 1.5 years. The early part was across Chavante country, who were in those days still uncontacted and quite warlike. It's like the American Wild West 100 years earlier. Anyway, they got through it. By then, it was decided to change the original idea of Vargas in setting up. It was a big national effort, with a lot of fanfare, even a government department to run it. And the idea was to cut into the forest with a view to colonizing it. But it was very soon realized that was absurd. So the motive changed to creating a string of airstrips diagonally across the center of Brazil. Little airstrips, unlit and unpaved, where they could fly Second World War C-47 Dakotas, the workhorse of the Allied armies in the Second World War. And these could land on those little airstrips. There was one at Aragaças, another at Xingu, and then the one, Cachimbo, which was the one that we cut out from, trying to find the Iriri. So they finally got through to the upper Xingu, where there's a cluster of magnificent tribes, which had, for a variety of reasons, I haven't got time to go into them all, but they had survived pretty well intact into the middle of the 20th century, largely because they weren't on a navigable river. And the Xingu, people couldn't get, foreigners, Europeans or North American, couldn't get up the Xingu. So they were protected there. And the Villas-Boas, they went on with their exploring for the government for another 2 years, and doing spectacular trail cutting and mapping. These are really tough expeditions. They make Indiana Jones look like a stroll in Central Park. This is really tough stuff. But they soon realized that these tribal peoples were exceptional. And so they came to devote the rest of their lives, the whole second half of the 20th century, to try to help those people. And the combination of them, by then the most famous explorers in South America, And because this string of airstrips was controlled by the Air Force, they could only allow in there invited people, scientists or journalists or a few politicians that they knew could help the indigenous people. Their whole lives were their only thing in the whole rest of their lives was devoted to helping those indigenous people. So they used their fame as explorers to, in effect, to change Brazilian public opinion. Because the journalists could get in easily, fly in on these planes once a week and see this wonderful Brazilian story, these three glamorous brothers and these magnificent tribes in a Garden of Eden paradise, and also all 100% Brazilian. So the picture magazines, Cruzeiro and Manchete, equivalents to Life magazine in the United States at that time. So they got terrific publicity, and that really changed public opinion, and through public opinion, politicians, to see the indigenous people as something that Brazil could be really proud of. So that was one of their exploring was a great achievement in itself. I'm proud to say that eventually they were loaded with honors, twice nominated for Nobel Peace Prize by all the world's great anthropologists, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Durkheim, and Charles Wagley in the States, and all the Brazilian anthropologists. But their first big international award, I'm proud to say, was the gold medal of the Royal Geographical Society, before my time. And I think there was 5 reasons why they would have, each of which they would have earned those medals. One was the exploring, which was the most spectacular exploring in South America at that time. The second was that changing public opinion about the indigenous people, and also changing the modus operandi, because the Villas-Boas had no training as anthropologists, and nor had they worked for the Indian Protection Service. So they almost devised a method of working with the Indians, but treating them as not as regarding themselves as representatives of the national society, like a colonial district commissioner, but seeing themselves as equals and friends and helpers of the indigenous people. One brother died in an operation in 1961, so there were just the 2 brothers, Orlando and Claudio. And they ran the Upper Xingu for 30 years. So that's another great reason why they earned that medal. During that time, the cluster of tribes of the Upper Xingu, which had all grown to be almost identical to one another in everything except language, but they were at war, that's too strong a word, but they were fighting other peoples to the north, the Metotiri, Kayapor, and the Juruna, and the Suia, and then to the west and to the southwest. To the west was the people that had killed Richard Mason. When he was killed, nobody knew who'd done it. We didn't know whether we somehow got near an indigenous village. And Orlando, he was vaguely aware of this people who they were not contacted for another 12 years to 1973. They called Panara. But that was the last of the Villas-Boas' 5 hostile tribes that they contacted. and persuaded them to stop fighting one another, and that their greatest threat was the encroaching colonization frontier, destroying the forests all around them. And so they brought what's loosely called Pax Xinguana, the peace to that part of Brazil between the tribes. I got them to actually become great friends. Two of the great spokesmen for Brazil's indigenous people are now Raoni Metuktiri, who was that was one of the 5 tribes that Vilas Boas contacted. And then Aritana, who was a wonderful man, who's just sadly just died of COVID-19. He was a sort of dynamic young chief's son that Vilas Boas saw him as a potential leader, and he was highly regarded and loved paramount chief of all the Upper Xingu tribes. A good friend of mine, Aritana. So that was another reason why they earned all those plaudits they got. Then they realized that, because part of the secret of their success was that they could control entry, because the only way you could get into the Upper Xingu was through these weekly Air Force flights in the propeller-driven Dakota planes. And because they could control entry, they realized that change was inevitable, that these peoples had to change to come to terms with the modern world. But they wanted change to be slow enough that the indigenous people could absorb the changes at the speed they wanted. And also without, this is a really key thing, without losing their respect in their own societies and their pride in their own way of life. And amazingly, they succeeded. They brought all these, by then about 15 peoples from hunter-gatherer with rudimentary agriculture of manioc, and pre-literate, of course, pre-metal, into complete familiarity with the modern world. A lot of those young men in the Upper Xingu now got Facebook sites. And even when I first went to the Upper Xingu, or no, later in the 70s, the indigenous people were already talking the plains in and even repairing them. So they've done in 2 generations what the rest of the world has taken thousands of years to come from early, if you've read the book Sapiens, early culture to modern, but without losing their pride in their communal way of life, which is a great achievement.
Yeah,
and that's why there's my book, which I love these 2 guys. They were slightly eccentric, Claudio and Orlando, but in a very interesting way. But amazingly, they're very famous in Brazil. As I say, they got every sort of honor. Even twice, a carnival floats in the Rio Carnival devoted to Orlando, and he was made a hero of the nation in the year 2000. but not well enough known outside Brazil. My biography of them is the first in English. And actually, it's the first biography of them, but they themselves wrote a lot and have a great deal of media coverage.
and you did such a wonderful job, telling it, and also the conservation legacy of their work, which I guess would be unexpected. I wanted to follow up on another thing you said. So there was this period of time in Brazil where there was a lot of support for conservation and indigenous peoples. You mentioned that the conquest of Brazil's indigenous peoples is still going on. it'd be great to hear you expand on that a little bit of, what is the situation now, and how has it changed since maybe, the
But
view
because almost the greatest achievement of the Villas was the creation of what's called the Xingu Indigenous Park. And this was way back in 1952, very soon after they got to the Upper Xingu. Four people had this radical idea. The four people were Orlando, I suppose, two anthropologists, Darcy Ribeiro, and Eloisa Torres, who was the director of the Museo Nacional. I think she was the first Brazilian woman to be head of a major national institution. And then a senior civil servant, Field Air Marshal Abaújo, who was head of Brazilian civil aviation. Anyway, these four had this radical idea of protecting a gigantic area of tropical forest only for the people living in it and for its flora and fauna. So it's a national park, but not a national park in the sense you have in the United States, we have in Britain, where anyone can visit it. This was only for the people living there. And they launched that, they put the idea to the vice president of Brazil in 1952, and he said, we'll go and write it up as legislation, which they did. And then that was presented to the then president, Getúlio Vargas, who quite liked the idea. But none of them had any idea that it was actually going to take 9 years of political struggle to get it through, because they thought it was such a gigantic area that the governor of the state of Mato Grosso realized it was about a quarter of his state was going to be set aside just for the indigenous people living in those forests. So he mounted a counter campaign, and he and his chums started selling it off as property lots. And then both sides had their own media. There were passionate articles written for and against. And then it got into the parliamentary system, and in the Senate and Congress, it sort of bogged down, and every clause of this draft legislation was being gone over. Until finally in 1961, Brazil elected in a landslide a dynamic young man called Quadros, Jânio Quadros. And he had been governor of the state of Mato Grosso, but he was a family friend of the Villas-Boas family, and he'd been there and seen what wonderful work they were doing and what a fantastic place it was and how important it was in Brazilian culture. So he decided to ram the whole thing through as a presidential decree, because it had bogged down hopelessly in the democratic process. So, but he said to he sacked the head of the Central Brazil Foundation and put his own man in. And he said to him, you've got to get the governor of Mato Grosso on board, and then we can push it through. So they got the governor on board by drastically reducing the size of the park. They reduced it to 26,000 square kilometers from about 3 times that. But that's still a substantial amount. That's about as big as the state of Massachusetts or the state of New Hampshire, or in Britain, bigger than Wales. But what was important was that was the prototype. That was the first in the world where a great swathe of tropical rainforest was protected just for the people living in it. Because indigenous people live in a forest, so that's their home, whereas the rest of us cut it down and try to turn it into pasture or grow soya. So that was in some ways their greatest of all their achievements, because that Xingu Indigenous Park has been replicated all over Brazil and in Colombia, and to a lesser extent in other Amazonian countries, in Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia. So those indigenous reserves in Brazil alone add up to about 1,250,000 square kilometers. That is a substantial amount of the world's surviving tropical rainforest. Brazil has got about half the surviving forests, and those indigenous reserves add up to the northern part of Brazil is called Amazonia Legal, all the states in the Amazon basin, and those indigenous reserves are about a quarter of that. So, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, rarely have so many done so much, rarely have so many owed so much to so few. So many is the rest of us. What we owe is conservation of a substantial amount of the world's surviving tropical rainforest to so few, to those indigenous people who are its custodians. Of course, it's thanks to the enlightened Brazilian government that after the 26 years of military rule in Brazil, in 1988, they had a new constitution. And that constitution, thanks to Villas-Boas and to many other activists, it contains two clauses that were very, very pro-indigenous people, very important. They said, in effect, these are the original Brazilians, and they have right to any land that they need for their spiritual or physical or cultural survival. And because of that, in the decades after the Xingu Park, all over Brazil, different river valleys or groups of indigenous people, always helped by activists, battled and got the enormous reserves awarded to them. And since 1988, every president of Brazil has added a bit, another few indigenous reserves to this great amount. So, until, of course, the current incumbent President Jair Bolsonaro, who said he's not going to declare a single hectare more. But actually, that doesn't really matter because there are no indigenous people left who haven't got their land protected.
There's been this dramatic political shift, and the dynamics in the Amazon are trending in a negative direction in terms of the health of the ecosystem. So a lot of people would argue that there are kind of new threats to indigenous people in terms of lack of law enforcement and land invasions and encroachment and whatnot. And I would just be curious as to your take on that.
Yeah, well, it goes back to the first really big move in destroying the Amazon forest was 1971, when the then military president of Brazil launched the PIN, the Program for National Integration, with the Trans-Amazonica Highway, and then BR-364, the big highway along the southern edge of the massive forest through Rondônia and Acre, and then a big north-south road, the BR-163, the Soya Highway. But those big roads, penetration roads, caused a huge internal migration during the 1980s, particularly the decade of destruction. But Brazil had and does still have a very good record for conservation, and it built up to 1992 the Earth Summit, the United Nations conservation, environment, and development in Rio de Janeiro. And so, as I said, because not only those indigenous reserves, but there's also a lot of environmental reserves and national forests. So Brazil up to now has protected a magnificent amount, but there is a great deal of rainforest destruction. The Xingu Indigenous Park, which when I first saw it was just in the middle of miles and miles and miles of unbroken forest. Now it looks like Central Park in New York or Hyde Park in London. It's just a great patch of green surrounded by devastation on all sides. Soya, people have cut down forest to try to. Soya is the only commercial crop plant that will grow on the very weak soil under a destroyed rainforest. But the three drivers of rainforest destruction are timber, soya, and beef. At first, we thought the three benefits that a tropical rainforest gives to the planet are rain, that generates a huge amount of rain. It falls on the forest and comes back as evapotranspiration. Carbon sequestration. Those tropical rainforests absorb gigantic quantities of carbon, as much carbon as we human beings put into the atmosphere. Conversely, if they are destroyed, either cut and rotted or burned, that carbon is released. And if that tonnage of carbon was released into Earth's atmosphere, it would be totally catastrophic. I think it would trigger another extinction. But the third great benefit that the rainforests provide is that this is the world's richest terrestrial ecosystem. It is home to millions of plants and flora and fauna and their habitats. This, of course, is not a commercial reason, but it's a moral one. And President Bolsonaro is a God-fearing Christian, but he has no right, we the human race has no right to destroy millions and millions of fellow creatures that God has put on this planet and their habitats. But you asked me before whether is a danger of a tipping point in the Amazon forest. Of course, this is a thing that worries scientists because the rate of deforestation is constant every year, and it was increasing greatly in the early part of this century, and it's now increasing again, as you just said. And so is there a tipping point at which so much forest will have gone, resulting in so much loss of rain, and so there will be a downward spiral. Far from contributing rain for its own survival, the tropical rainforests will be tipped over into actually increasing their own loss. But one hope is that politicians will realize that they're making quite a lot of money through beef and soya, as I said, the one plant that can grow under. By the way, the reason that the soil under a forest is so weak, I'm sure you know this, but is it a tropical rainforest is it's got deciduous trees, but it's an evergreen system. It never calms down with a fall or winter when the humus can accumulate. So it's constantly on the go, and it's about 5 times the biomass of a temperate forest and growing at about 5 times the speed. So all the trees, most of their root system is horizontal to capture all the falling nutrients. They will have 1 or 2 deep roots to get water, but otherwise, all the falling nutrient is recaptured. It gets up into the growing system because all the trees are trying to get up to the canopy where the sun and the rain are. As a result, if you clear that away, the soil is almost inert when it's baked in the tropical sun. Someone said it looks like a big parking lot. And therefore, I used to think that cattle ranching was never going to work in the Amazon because it's too far to get the animals to a slaughterhouse, and also it was too difficult to grow decent pasture. But unfortunately, there are now strains of grass, colonial and others, which do survive in clearings, and also they've imported mostly cattle, Gujarat and other breeds of cattle from South Asia, humped cattle, which can stand the heat and the ticks. So cattle ranching is a big threat, and as I keep saying, soya is the one product. But the profit from those, from the timber, the soya, and the beef, is hugely outweighed by the loss of rain in southern Brazil. And the cost, Sao Paulo, the biggest city in South America, was running really short of water. And also Brazil has invested heavily in hydroelectric dams. Well, hydroelectric dams can't work if the level in those rivers has sunk so much through lack of rain. So the hope is that politicians will realize that getting a quick profit from destroying the Amazon is actually an own goal, because you're damaging the breadbasket of southern Brazil and causing loss of rain, quite apart from the problem of carbon. So there's a hope that they will see the light on that, but may not. Public opinion in Brazil has always been very good environmentally, and taking pride in what the country's done. But I think now with COVID and economic recession, that's, as with all of us, the environment has gone rather to the back in their concerns. And then of course, with the current regime of President Bolsonaro being hostile to indigenous people and also hostile to protecting so much tropical rainforest. So that he hasn't so far given licenses for mining inside indigenous reserves, but that's quite a strong possibility. Most of those reserves are homologated, and they've got to the final stage of being given property security, but quite a lot have not got that far. And Bolsonaro is saying that anyone who has got claims against those indigenous reserves that aren't properly homologated can put forward their claims to that land. So there's a threat there. Um, so, and also in the current climate, the Indigenous Foundation Funai has been starved of money, and some of its best people have left, and the Irama is just trying to stop rainforest destruction and all the people invading forests for mining or timber. But there's Brazil, of course, has a lot of very poor people who if they get a feeling that there's gold in those rivers, of course they'll go in and try and get it out. And they know that in the current climate of this government, that there's far less legal constraint on them.
So what is it that you would recommend to the average person in the West, so Europe or the United States, if they wanted to do something to try to help the situation in the Amazon?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. It's not easy. Obviously, try to avoid those three products: beef, timber, and soya. Of course, that's very difficult to do because soya is great animal feed, and the world has got even more billions of chickens than it has people. So, but an ordinary consumer can at least try to find out where the origin of those products, but above all, tell their supermarkets and their shops they want to be sure that those have checked whether it's legitimately, particularly the timber, legitimately logged. So put pressure on their shops. For direct action, because nobody in the world likes to be told by foreigners what to do, least of all Brazilians, who are very proud and great people in a fantastic country. So direct action, like bombarding politicians with emails or even telephone calls, would be counterproductive. But I put your question to one of Brazil's top anthropologists, and she said that you directly tried to influence Brazilian politicians is no good, but partly because Brazil has got wonderful scientists and activists of its own. But she said that one thing is that Brazil likes to be liked, like all countries, and understandably, because it's a wonderful country. And so media either praise of Brazil for what it's achieved, but criticism for rainforest destruction getting into the media it is effective, because that gets reported back by the Brazilian diplomats. And so you in Mongabay are doing a grand job in trying to influence Brazilian people to stop the rainforest destruction and resume their pride in their wonderful conservation that they have done in the past. Yeah, and it's, well, as you can see, Brazil is a great country. The Amazon is a fantastic place. The world has got nothing like it. And the indigenous people are wonderful. So you can understand why I so love those places, and also why I've chosen to write this first biography of those fantastic Villas-Boas brothers.
Yeah, it's a really
people of the rainforest.
It's a really wonderful book, and you have such great photos in it as well.
Well, you're doing a great job with Mongabay.
No, well, thank
Keep
you.
it up.
Mongabay.